This is Tim Murdoch, and you're watching White Rabbit Radio, of course. And what you're getting ready to see is part of our exclusive interview series that we're going into for In-Game Exotica, which is our paywall series. Paywall podcast comes out 6 times a week, actually 3 times a week, but there's about 6 of them. And we're going to start doing interviews again, which we haven't done in quite a while, this time on video. Part of it's going to make it to YouTube, part of it isn't. And you're getting ready to watch Mr. Keith Woods. Definitely check out his links in the description and support him in any way you can. Cheers. This is H Avenger, Tim Murdoch, and I am talking today with one of the budding Irish nationalists, Keith Woods. And we're hammering through the woodpile, as they say in U.S. prison systems. In the U.S. prison systems, if you're white, you're considered a woodpecker, and you got to roll with the woodpecker because you got to roll with the woodpile because you're considered a minority. And in Ireland, things are getting out of control. I know a lot of you guys out there write me, Horace, and I wouldn't even dare do an Irish accent. It's coming here. White genocide is coming here. The Great Replacement is coming here. They're flooding the place. And we have on Keith Woods to talk about the moves against that with free speech. And in America, a lot of us historically on our side has taken free speech for granted. As you guys know, Bob Whitaker, the late Bob Whitaker, would never take it for granted. That's why they used the free speech laws in America to get out some of the most aggressive memes in the history of the planet. With that being said, Keith, how are you doing this morning?
Yeah, not too bad. Good to be here.
This evening.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. I mean, definitely things my side of the world are really going full steam ahead, and I think in a certain sense there's kind of an older nationalist contingent, and things have happened at such a rate, and the motives behind them seem so sinister that people almost don't know how to deal with it. It's like a unique kettle of fish. I mean, no one ever expected that their government would suddenly take on a policy where they're openly trying to replace them and openly hostile to natives. So, I mean, from that perspective, I think people are looking more to the European right and to what's going on in the US for kind of answers and to see the track record on this. And, from my perspective, looking at what's happened in other European countries, I think this is just the beginning.
Yeah, Ireland is a small place with a small population. I guess it's a pretty good sized island with a small population, and it has enormous natural resources. What has shocked me about, and you've spoken about this in your videos, about the symbolic nature of where they are welcoming these immigrants. They're welcoming them on like very historic Irish places of interest.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Even if I don't tend to always be very conspiratorial in that, there are people that they'll always try and look for a plot behind everything. I try to explain things more structurally, if possible at all. I think that's like a more parsimonious explanation. But I just challenge anyone, any leftist or anything, look at Ireland. What is the explanation? Why would the state, if they're resettling asylum seekers with, no background check, no criminal record check, anything. These are people that just show up and said the word asylum, and that's all we know about them. Almost always, young men, 99% economic migrants. We know that for a fact. Judges that have formerly worked on these cases said that it was 99% plus economic migrants. Why, of all places, would they choose a small island off the west coast of Ireland that, barely has internet? Like, this is like a real holdout of an older Ireland. Or, Connemara, one of the tourist hotspots of Ireland, again, because it's this like holdout of old culture and a more traditional Ireland that's really, out of place among the rest of Ireland. And it's just, there's no good explanation for the places they're targeting. They're all culturally significant. They're all rural. They're all places with strong, tight-knit communities. And it's like they're trying to prove a point that, we can do this to any part of the country, and that there isn't going to be any holdouts. There aren't going to be any ethnic enclaves anymore in New Ireland. you're going to have to get used to diversity and multiculturalism. And if you don't like it, we're going to rub your nose in it and force it on you regardless.
Yeah, for those that don't know the definition, whether you go replacement, erasure, or use the criminal accusation of genocide, is defined by the anti-white proposition. There can be no all-white anything. One of the vicious things about this process is when they start destroying cultures, and that's what they're obviously intentionally doing. I think it's a very poor-run conspiracy. But when you start the destruction of the culture, when everyone that gets off a boat becomes Irish, the Irish just become white. And that's where racial politics really comes in. That's what happened in America. Are you seeing that happen at all?
In terms of, say, a more dissident sort of white conscious right forming.
Well, I would say just on the street, the average, let's say the average Irish man or woman, it's got to be happening in places like Dublin. Start not so much identifying with Irish first, but start identifying with their color first, because they're white and maybe they're being discriminated against over, let's say, an asylum seeker, and they've got a bunch of Nigerians around there, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, it just becomes Ireland doesn't mean anything anymore. Being Irish doesn't mean anything anymore. Everything becomes race. There comes a point when you universalize a culture that you basically just rip it down to race.
Yeah, and that's why it's kind of funny, that there's the growth of all these anti-whites here now. We have, these Green Party politicians and these sort of faux academics that have degrees in race studies. And, they're coming on TV attacking Irish people from the perspective of whiteness. And, they're using all these arguments that you just know they've heard from, Jewish academics that is applicable in the United States or whatever. And they're using it in the context of Ireland. And everyone is just like, Irish people are just confused when they hear this, because they're using arguments about, privilege and whiteness. And it's like, a couple of 100 years ago, we had a famine, and half the population literally, disappeared in the space of a few years. And the concept of the Irish being privileged is just absurd. But they're bringing this at people, and it's being constantly bombarded now on TV and everything else. And now the income and hate speech laws. So yeah, I mean that's been the root of attack for the anti-whites here. And because they're fighting on this plane, it's not really a plane that Irish people are used to fighting on. So I think the response can be very confused. I used to love getting the feel for Dublin taxi drivers, because they're like the most based people alive. But you'd find a lot of them were quite fond of like Tommy Robinson and the anti-Islam movement, and it was like, again, it was like they were thinking along racial lines, and they were thinking along ethnic nationalism. But the only avenue that they can see, the only healthy avenue for that tendency, that emotion, is this kind of anti-Islam release valve. So I think that's a shame in a way that even the most like hardcore, like full on like racist people, you'll find they still have accepted the brainwashing to an extent that they think the only way to express what are healthy drives is through the prism of I'm just criticizing Islam. And I just hope the National Party, if nothing else, can make it okay to assert Irishness again, because it's something that's been just kind of beaten out of us last 20-30 years through media propaganda and whatnot.
An acquaintance of mine had moved to Ireland. I'd say it's been, I don't want to give too many specifics because it's not a big place. But he was talking about he migrated there because there's a massive Irish diaspora, as you know. Half of the requests I got to interview you were from Irish diaspora, so they are hearing this. And he was back there for work with a big company. There's companies in there. I don't want to be too specific. But he said it was pretty funny when the Irish found out he was American. They assumed he was Irish American by name, which he is. maybe 80-90% of his ancestors are from the island. You know this story. And that he was back there for work and everything else. People were calling him an immigrant, and they're like, oh, he's not an immigrant, he's white. So I thought that was funny. They're identifying immigrants and migrants with non-whites in a kind of a roundabout way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like see, they always have the unique tactics for every country and how they'll justify it. Like it's funny to me that in the UK, they justify the mass non-white migration by this thing. You were colonists. You went into these people's lands without their permission. You committed these terrible crimes. Now you have to take the third world. They use this with France as well. Like they have to take North African migrants because they colonized North Africa, which is really warped logic. But then in the case of Ireland, which never colonized anyone, which was colonized, they have to use this logic of oh well, you were colonists. You suffered under an empire, so you of all people should understand the plight of these other peoples. So your comrade, your history isn't one of ethno-nationalism. So your comrades aren't other European ethno-nationalists. No, your history is one of a struggle of the oppressed against the oppressors. So your comrades are actually Nigerians and Pakistanis and all these other oppressed peoples of the world. So this really like toxic left-wing manipulation and interpretation of our history. But yeah, I mean, people know that there's a difference. When people talk about foreigners, quote unquote, they're not talking about Brits here, or Western Europeans here. I mean, there was a huge level of migration from Eastern Europe during the economic boom period, especially from Poland, and I remember there would have been a lot of hostility to the Poles around then. But interestingly enough, I think in the last 10 years, that's actually lessened. Because if you know any Poles in Ireland, generally they came, they worked, and they raised a family. And they're usually like, good Christian, wholesome people. So it was kind of a learning experience the last 10 years that if you have white migration, while it's still probably not ideal, and the Poles were taking a lot of low-skilled work and maybe served to drive down wages. At the same time, when you have white migration, they're going to integrate. They're not going to cause any problems. You don't see a crime problem amongst Polish migrants. But 10 years on, I forget the statistic on this, but it's something like 60+% of African migrants in Ireland are unemployed. And that's in a country with a virtually no unemployment, like it's below 5%. It's virtually full employment. So yeah, there's definitely a waking up in the last few years about the racial lines that delineate these things.
Well, the Nigerians, which I know can be a problem, like with drugs and everything else, and the various different Africans in there, that is virtually recent. That's what, in the last 10 years?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, the non-white population, by like at the start of the Celtic Tiger, the economic boom period, was like virtually nil, and even 10 years ago wasn't very large. It is just the last decade, between the last decade and the last 2 decades, that's just been this influx.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought you were continuing, but well, that's kind of interesting. So everyone's starting to notice things, and everyone's starting to speak out about things. And I know there's several channels popping up. Many of them are very good. Irish Patriot. They all have their own take on things. Yours is more of I would consider intellectual, but at the same time. You have this particular process where the Irish are undergoing this. They're starting to notice things. And I've noticed a great deal of activism started. They're pissing people off.
Yeah, well, you see, this is the thing. You talk about the channels popping up. One of the reasons I set up a channel was I'm seeing there's definitely great intent and motivation there, and that there's all these different things popping up, and people really want to do something. But as I said, because this is a relatively new phenomenon for Ireland, there's like in a lot of ways, there's a lack of understanding, and people react and they deal with it in this reactionary way. So some people will go down like an anti-Islam route and try and mimic Tommy Robinson, or some people will get so deep into conspiracies on it that they end up doing 3-hour live streams on chemtrails or something. But a lot of it is like trying to find a way to assert ethno-nationalism without a certain ethno-nationalism. And it's like, for me, I don't know, a part of the setting up the channel was just trying to make a clear philosophical case that you can just assert this without having to do all these mental gymnastics and try and defend it within the liberal morality. Because I mean, we have, Ireland is unique as well in the fact that we have two political parties that are absolutely dominant, and we've never had a strong left-wing party. Like, from the foundation of the state right up until recently, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have had 80 to 90% of the seats in Parliament, and they've basically swapped power for the last century. So, I mean, anyone that thinks that this is a left-wing problem, or that socialism is at the root of this, these have always really been two sort of neoliberal parties, at least since the 1970s. Fianna Fáil used to be kind of a populist, like nationalist party, but they kind of embraced economic openness and neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. And there isn't a strong ideological difference between either of them. And yet, despite that, you'd think that would be a something that would slow down the radical transformation. And yet, you look at it, in the early 90s, homosexuality was still illegal in Ireland. And, 20 years later, 1992, and then you skip forward to 2012 and the years after it, and we're voting to legalize abortion 60% to 40%. We're voting for legalizing gay marriage in similar numbers. So an absolutely radical transformation in 20 years. And it can't really be blamed on the political left. The political left was never a force here. What it can be blamed on is treacherous conservatives that ultimately put the market and the interests of bankers over their people, and forgot what the point of their parties was originally. They both came out of the Civil War split over a dispute on how best to achieve a united Ireland and national sovereignty. And as soon as they started integrating these beliefs in open borders and European integration, slowly just one principle after another of what founded them just disappeared, to the point now that they're just these empty shells that just kind of parrot the needs of their corporate overlords. And that's who's really in charge of Ireland now. It's the corporations, it's the Googles, the PayPals, the Facebooks that have their headquarters in Dublin, and that
cheap taxes
politicians are entirely subservient to. Yeah, I mean, you said we're rich in natural resources, and that's true, but we actually have these giveaway terms on our oil and natural gas. We have like the lowest terms on natural gas in terms of taxation than any country in Europe. We've given away our fisheries to the EU. You've Spain fishes most of our fish. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest losses of joining the EU. Is we've lost literally tens of billions of euros worth of fish. I mean, you have this ridiculous situation where trawlers have to, after they go and catch fish, if it's above a certain quota, they have to go back and dump it in the ocean. So we're not allowed to look after our own fisheries. That's up to the EU, and they have this ridiculous way of dividing it, where they kind of try and divide it equally between member states. And Spain actually ends up doing most of the fishing around the Irish Sea. as do Japanese trawlers, which Ireland is kind of.
I'm surprised. I'm surprised because the Irish, to me, you guys just sooner or later just say F it, and you get an Irish fishing boat that just goes out and catches fish and sells it to the local fishmonger, not even paying attention to the rules.
Yeah, and they're doing it out of protest. You know, the small,
they should.
the small fishers there, they're refusing to. You know, it's like, how can I dump good fish back into the sea that's already been caught? Like, it's ridiculous, you know, to match quotas of a bureaucrat in Brussels. But I mean, the thing is that there's absolutely no government support for the people anytime there's a clash between neoliberalism and the interests of the people. And the perfect example of this is, you know, our economic platform has been to basically become a tax haven for US capital. And, you know, the reason we've experienced such growth, the only reason really we survived the economic crash was through exports with the multinationals here. So the sole tactic really for economic growth has been to have, you know, this English-speaking educated workforce and low taxes.
They
so
have
that,
for clarification, you guys have one of the lowest corporate tax rate in the EU. That's why they're using you as like an offshore within the EU, correct?
Yeah, so it's 12.5%, which is like by far the lowest. But on top of that, most of the big corporations don't even pay that. Like, you know, the likes of your PayPal and Google, they're not paying that because they've all manner of systems that's kind of facilitated by the Irish state that allows them to get away with paying virtually nothing. And this is like the pact we make with the devil that, you know, we'll get the jobs and the exports out of it. Well, at the same time, we're really screwing over the rest of Europe by just undercutting them, because at the same time you're forcing other countries to lower their corporate tax rates to try and compete. You know, like you're forcing the US to lower their tax rates so they're not losing their companies to tax havens, which doesn't seem fair. And the funniest example of the attitude of the government here is the EU actually ruled a couple of years ago that Apple had not paid the tax it owed to the Irish state, that it had used all these sort of double blinds and accounting systems to avoid 12 billion euros worth of taxes. So Brussels ruled that Apple owed the Irish state 12 billion. Now you'd think happy days, like imagine what we could do with 12 billion, you know, fix the healthcare system, pay off a large chunk of our debt, whatever. Well, the Irish government is contesting this and is appealing it and going through the European courts again to contest this, because they claim it's a great insult to our reputation to say that we undercharged in taxation and that we have to take 12 billion. So the government is incredibly fighting the EU against getting 12 billion euros off Apple. I mean, it's absolutely, and every mainstream party, well, you know, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two dominant parties, both have a consensus on this. Like, no, we can't take that money. We have to maintain this this tax haven status. We can't do this great insult to Apple and take 12 billion off them. So this incredible scenario where the government of your people is fighting desperately not to have 12 billion taken from this multinational company into the coffers of the state.
You might have the Irish might have one of the greatest neocon. That's most of the policies are, you know, neocon, neoconservative, capitalist economies in the history of the world. It may be more egregious than America's in some way. It's just not as big. But that's the type of thing that they do. And then, of course, any positive expression of Irish identity is supposed to be against Islam and pro-Israel. It sounds like America.
Yeah, I mean, you see these patterns everywhere. It's the same pattern we've seen in the UK, where once people woke up to what was going on, that they try and direct it into the release valve of anti-Islam, and then, you know, you always find that suddenly the the anti-Islam crowd come out with the Israel flags, and everyone gets a bit confused about what's going on. Like Tommy Robinson, everyone was waiting for his big documentary release, and he comes out and announces after years of crowdfunding and grassroots support that his documentary is going to be called Shalom. And I mean, what do you even start? Yeah. Geert Wilders is no different. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is a rabid Zionist.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just the same across Europe. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense. How does anyone explain that? Like, why would a nationalist party be walking around with a flag from a country in the Middle East? Like, it's not our struggle. Whatever side you're on, it's just, there's no explaining it unless you explain it as it being these people appealing to Jewish money power, which it clearly is.
Oh yeah.
But I don't think, like, I think maybe we learned from Trump. Like, I followed the US election very closely, and was very optimistic about Trump and whatever. But I was always concerned by his really rabid stance on Iran, and I think most people probably overlooked it because they're like, I think maybe a lot of people thought, like, well, he has to do the pro-Israel talking points to get elected. Like, every Republican has to do that. He doesn't want the force of AIPAC and everything else against him. So, we can overlook this because he's still our guy on 90% of the issues. But then what you find is that he sticks to the Israel part and he abandons everything else. And
I gotta laugh because it's so absurd. Yeah.
You just say, but you always see this, all these figures like in the alt-right and these anti-Islam figures in Europe. Once that gets introduced, it just seems like an inevitable course that within a few years they're more concerned about the future of Israel than their own people. And I just think there's no place for any trace of Zionism now, and that if there's a lesson from Trump, it's that even a trace of this has to be rooted out, because it's just not compatible with a way of seeing the world that's pro-white and that's in favor of protecting your own people.
Well, 100% correct. I think Zionism has its place in Israel, but it has no place. I mean, if you're more worried about Zionism than what's happening in the Netherlands, you got problems. You've got big problems. Nationalism is always within its own borders. That's fine. But when you start this crazy, but we're in a crazy world. We're in a totally and utterly crazy world. You just talked about dumping fish, and we're going to end the first segment. And, someone was telling me how expensive fish was in Ireland. And it occurred to me during this talk, why? Because it doesn't make sense for fish to be so expensive, like good cod or good shellfish, because you got tons of it right off your shore, right? Some of the best fishing in the world. And they're telling me how expensive it was, and I'm like, that doesn't even make any sense to me. But it does now. It does now.
Yeah, it's just the irrationality of bureaucracy that leads to these absurd scenarios where you have, as I say, bureaucrats in Brussels dividing up fisheries based on these systems that make absolutely no sense to people, and the end result of it is you're telling some fisherman on the coast of Kerry that he has to dump his catch because it breaches this quota. It's obviously absurd.
It's
and
bullshit.
The EU in its current form is a joke. But I mean, the sinister thing as well about the Zionism thing is, for people that think they can hold their nose and vote for these parties that focus on the Zionism, the problem with them is they always frame immigration as a liberal issue. So it always turns into, well, we don't want Muslim immigration because they're going to harm our Jews, and we have to protect our Jews, and we're gonna have a Charlie Hebdo if we bring them in. So we have to protect our Jews, and then by extension, we have to protect our homosexuals, and we have to protect feminism because the Quran isn't compatible with third wave feminism and all this. So it always manipulates like ethno-national sentiment down this rabbit hole of this kind of liberal nationalism where you're not actually defending your people, you're trying to defend, your quote unquote values. And, Western values then are always equated with what's basically Jewish values. So, they have you, no matter what avenue you go down, they're going to have you because you're going to be defending the values of the system anyway, even if you're pushing for a tougher stance in immigration.
Yeah, the JQ always comes up. This is something I discussed going back years. What I did was I did one animation called Anti-Racist Hitler, and that's basically my statement on it.
Yeah.
You can just watch it a few times. You want to know my opinion. But I don't have a problem with the ideal people having a home or staying to their borders. It's just when the ideal what's best for a country, ultimately it boils down to what's best for one little country in the Middle East. It doesn't make any sense. It becomes a theater for the absurd. But it seems like capitalism is alive and well in Ireland and serving its destructive ultra-liberal purpose of tearing everything down. And we're going to end the first 30-minute segment right here for you guys that are watching this on YouTube. And we're going to go to the paywall segment where we can have some more free speech. And we'll be back right here in a second.